Today I wanted to share my thoughts on the tragic passing of Minecraft YouTuber Technoblade, who over his career amassed over 10 million subscribers, 1 billion views, and is one of the very few content creators I know of that was not involved in any drama, didn't get in it with other people, and nobody ever had a bad word to say about him. And now he's dead at the age of 23. I'm the same age as he is, so the thought of your life ending at any moment, like, you can do all the right things, you can eat healthy, exercise, go to the doctor, and do all these things, and still, the life is never guaranteed. It's something that we all know, but we don't really process it until we actually go through it ourselves or know someone who has gone through it. And the awful thing about cancer is that there are so many lives that were taken way too soon by this terrible disease. And it feels like everyone has a story. You know, that's why the whole story with Technoblade really hit home for me and really resonated with me and made me feel a certain way, like that I probably never felt with any other YouTuber death. And it's because Technoblade, I never watched any of his videos. I'm not gonna pretend just because he died that I was his biggest fan and that I loved his content, because truth be told, I didn't even know that he existed until he passed away. And that's just because I haven't been into Minecraft. I haven't watched Minecraft content on YouTube since like 2011, 2012. So I was just not a part of that scene. But his death still hit me hard just because of the nature of his death. 23 years old, stage 4 cancer. I can imagine the last 6 months or so of his life was a living hell. And it's something I wouldn't even wish on my worst enemy. It's just an awful way to go out. Anyone that's known someone who had cancer, or maybe you've been through cancer yourself and somehow survived it, and, you know, for that, I'm very glad that you're still here if you're one of those people and that you were able to pull through. But for a lot of people, especially stage 4, it's an uphill battle to say the least. And it's something that is very difficult to come to terms with, that your death is imminent, especially at a young age like Technoblade, 23 years old. It reminds me so much of one of my good friends from high school who was just, oh my god, he was the nicest guy you could ever meet in your entire life. He went off to college, you know, like a lot of us did, you know, in my friend group, so we kind of all went our own way, but we still kept in touch with each other. Like, we would hang out during every break from college, like Thanksgiving weekend, winter break, spring break, stuff like that. And he was doing really well in college. He went to school to be a chef. He was very passionate about cooking, and to pay through college, he was a part of the school's wrestling team, which he was also a part of back in high school. And, you know, I would always joke with him and my other friend who was also on the wrestling team, because they were trying to get me to join, and I'm like, okay, I'll go to the tryout and I'll bring my steel chair and I'll hit everyone in the head with it. Obviously, mat wrestling and pro wrestling are two very different things, but I would always joke around and pretend that I thought that the wrestling team they were on was that kind of wrestling instead. But anyway, he was on the wrestling team in college, and what happened was he was in a wrestling match, and one of his opponents accidentally gave him a headbutt, and his jaw was swollen up so bad. Like, it was bad enough where he had to get it checked out by a doctor, because it was like the most swollen you could ever imagine, like completely blown up like a balloon, and it didn't go away after weeks, and he was in a lot of pain. So he got it checked out, definitely not thinking it was going to be anything more than just a very swollen jaw from a headbutt. Turned out to be a swollen jaw because he had bone cancer in his jaw. Now, the reaction that they had at first was like, you know, it's the earliest stage, that, you know, because it really ended up being a fluke, like, that they even caught it, because if he would never got the headbutt, they wouldn't even known that he had cancer for much longer times. They were like, okay, you know, we're gonna do the surgery to remove the bone from your jaw and, like, replace it with a bone that was, like, in his leg or his foot or something, like a bone that he didn't need to function, but they used it to, like, replace the bone they were taking off, the bone that had the cancer in it. But the cancer was also spreading, so they were doing chemotherapy as well. And, oh man, just seeing him like that, because I've been to the hospital and visited him multiple times. A lot of the time, I would visit him and wouldn't even get to say a word to him, or he wouldn't respond to me, because he was so knocked out from the chemo and all the shit they were doing to his body that I would come there, and he would say hello to me or whatever, and then would like just fall asleep, and I would just be chilling in the waiting room for like 5 hours and wouldn't really get to spend a lot of time with him because he was just so out of it. And I remember that one day I came, he was really in a bad place. Like, he was crying so much. I'd never seen him cry ever before, but he was just in so much pain that he couldn't help but just cry in pain. It wasn't even like an emotional cry, it was a pain cry. And, you know, he was a tough guy too. But, you know, when you have cancer, forget it. It'll make the toughest men cry. So, eventually he was actually discharged from the hospital. They determined that he was cancer-free. After the chemotherapy and the surgery, they're like, you're all good to go. You know, you're in remission. And you do not have cancer anymore. And I remember when everyone in my friend group found out about that he was cancer-free, we were just so overjoyed. Like, it was just, you can't describe the emotion that we were feeling. It was a feeling of relief and happiness and all these different things because our friend was going to pull through. He was actually going to make it because for a while we didn't know, like, honestly, we didn't know what was going to happen. But we weren't very optimistic at the same time either. Like, we knew this was bad. But to finally hear that he was cancer-free, it was just, oh my god, it was just a great feeling. Probably one of the best feelings I ever felt in my life. But, you know, his body was knocked out from all that treatment over a year's time that we didn't really get to see him that much. He moved out to Long Island with his mother, so, you know, we didn't live too close to each other, so, you know, and none of us had cars or anything, so it was really hard, like, to see him. But one time we actually did get to see him. It was actually the Conor McGregor versus Floyd Mayweather boxing fight. And I remember we were having so much fun, even though he couldn't talk because the surgery was still messing up, like his jaw was still very swollen, and he could barely say anything, and when he did talk, it was really hard to understand what he was saying, but it was just so good for him, like him being there, because it's been so long since we were all hanging out together. But sadly, it turned out to be the last time, because his cancer came back with a vengeance. It ended up being a lot worse than the last time before. And he passed away about 9 months after we last saw him. Now, the thing is, he wasn't telling anybody what was going on. We didn't even know that his cancer came back until he died. 19 years old, dead. I'll never forget that phone call. My best friend Ethan called me all sad, and he told me that he died. And I was just shocked, like, more than anything else. Like, you know, the sadness didn't even come until later. Just, like, what? Like, just shock. Like, that was the first thing that came through my head, and it was the first thing that I was feeling was like, wait, what? Dead? Like, first I was like, how did he die? Because as far as I knew, his cancer was gone, but in the back of my mind, I definitely knew that it had to have been cancer. And then when we went to the funeral, his mother and his family was telling us, like, yeah, he didn't want us to concern ourselves with him. He didn't want us to see him like that either, because he was, like, immobile. Like, he couldn't even walk at a certain point, and he just didn't want us, like, he wanted us to keep living our lives and not concern ourselves with him, which is just insane to think about. But who knows, if I was in the same position, would I do the same thing? I honestly don't know what I would do until I was in that situation, so I definitely can't fault him for what he did, you know, kind of boxing us out and us not even knowing that he was sick again. But I just remember how surreal it felt. Like, I was in denial the entire time that I was in the funeral. I think at one point I was just bursting into tears because just the entire scene finally got to me of my good friend from high school, seeing him directly in front of me in a casket. I didn't see the body, but still, just knowing that he was in that casket and he was dead. Like, no, my age, you don't die. You're immortal. You know what I mean? Like, you don't die at 19, 20 years old. But I think for all of us, for me and all my friends, it really was a wake-up call to just how precious life is, and that you never know when your time is up. It could be tomorrow. It could be a year from now. Like, you know, it's not guaranteed that you're gonna die in your sleep at 85. Like, that's actually a pretty rare thing. But definitely just not just the experience of losing a friend, but also the way in which he died, and the fact that he died at such a young age. I think it changed all of our lives forever, and I still miss him. I still think about him a lot, and I really wish he was still here. But I think of all the deaths that have affected me in my entire life so far, the one that has really hurt me the most was definitely my father, who also died of cancer. He actually died a year ago today, July 2nd 2021. And I'm lucky to have had a great relationship with my dad. I loved him so much, and he loved me too, and we had a really good bond. But yeah, it was actually skin cancer that got him, and his story was probably the craziest I have ever heard. So what happened was, so my father was a very accident-prone individual. I'll just put it that way. I mean, I can make like a 5-hour video talking about all the shit that my dad did and how many times he'd gotten himself into the hospital. Between pancreatitis, where he almost died when I was 3. I almost didn't even know my father, so at least, he survived through that. He set himself on fire one time. That happened when I was 9 years old, and that almost scarred me for life. And 5 years ago, he was going through kidney failure, where it was called, I think the exact diagnosis was end-stage renal disease. He had so much shit built up because his kidneys weren't working that his feet were swollen, and he had the stomach of a pregnant woman, and he was basically immobile, and was on dialysis. And if you know what dialysis is, it's not a very good thing, and it usually means that it's the end. But somehow, some way, I think it was like 6 months after that diagnosis of end-stage kidney failure, he recovered, made a full recovery, and was off dialysis and lived another 4 years. And what killed him ended up not having to do anything with the kidney failure. It was cancer. And then there were smaller, non-life-threatening injuries that he got himself into. He broke his ribs like 3 or 4 times through different accidents. One time he fell 20 feet in the air from a snowmobile. Another time he fell in the shower and like slipped on soap or some bullshit. And I forget what else. He broke his ribs mad times. It was pretty crazy. He got hit by a taxi cab. He hit his head, fell on a turnstile in the subway station. Man, there are so many things. I'm not even going to bother listing all the accidents he was in. There was another one that happened before I was born where he was going hunting or shooting. He was doing target practice, I think. And he shot a bullet and it ricocheted off of like, I don't even know what. It was a rock or something. But he told me that the bullet bounced back and he could feel the bullet going through his hair. Like, he could feel it on his hair, and it, like, went right through. Like, that's just insane. Like, you can't make that up. Because, like, 1 millimeter more, like, if it went 1 millimeter further down, he would have been shot in the head and he would have been dead. And I wouldn't exist today. But of his many accidents, the most recent one involved my $6,000 ATV that I didn't even have for like a month before he wrecked it. And I'm not even going to get into that whole story, but basically, after the accident, he got a full CAT scan, to see like if there was any organ damage, obviously, because that was a really bad accident. He like flew he flew like all the way down the mountain, and the ATV was rolling right behind him, and the wheels of the ATV like actually ran over his head, and he got a concussion and got knocked the fuck out for like an hour at least. But during that CAT scan, they didn't find anything because they scan for everything. Like, they check for like anything that's in that body. They do a thorough scan, and he turned out to be fine. There was nothing wrong with him, which was great because it could have been a lot worse. And 2 weeks later, he was up and moving like nothing happened. Like, he didn't wreck a $6,000 ATV, which I obviously forgave him for because I cared more about his health than anything else. But the reason why I'm bringing up the ATV in particular is because a few months later, he started getting lumps around his neck. First, he thought nothing of it because it was one lump. It kind of looked like a big mosquito bite or something like that. Like, it didn't look like anything alarming. But then there were 2 lumps, and then 3 lumps, and 5 lumps, and 10. And I think the total number at the end of the day ended up being something like 50 lumps in his neck, in his throat, on his shoulder, his arms. Like, there was something going on really, really bad, like, all of a sudden, and it definitely needs to get checked out. Turned out he had stage 4 squamous cell carcinoma, which is a skin cancer. And yeah, it was stage 4. Not stage 3, not 2, not 1. It was stage 4, the worst stage that you could possibly have for any cancer. And I remember when he was officially diagnosed, the doctor was like, wait, wasn't he at this hospital before and he had a full body scan? So this should have come up. He's like, the doctors definitely did something wrong. Like, there was definitely something there. Like, the doctor that did the scan did something wrong, and they didn't like report it, or they didn't detect it. But he looked back and he was like, oh shit, like, there was literally nothing there. So this was May of 2020, full body scan. He was completely clean. There was not a sign of cancer. There was not a sign of anything. in his body. 6 months later, stage 4 cancer. So that's just, it completely boggles the mind. And then his experience with cancer, he was never in remission like my friend was, but it was full of ups and downs. Like, so they started off with the chemotherapy, which, he at first he was like, years ago, he was like, oh, if I ever had cancer, I'm never going to do chemo, I'm never going to do treatment or anything, I'm just going to let myself die, and I'm not going to do anything. Like, when you, like, it's one thing to, like, say that, but then when you actually have the cancer, it completely changes your perspective, I guess, because he was all in. He was like, oh, no, I'm doing the chemo, give me the strongest dose you could possibly do. So they did, and for a while, like, the chemo actually worked at getting rid of the shit, and the cancer was mostly gone, but he wasn't quite in remission. The cancer was still there, but what happened was the chemo ended up knocking his ass out, like, really bad. Like, I think the chemo killed him more than the cancer itself. I think one or the other would have killed him. Like, the cancer obviously would have killed him. I'm not trying to say, oh, he'd still be alive without the chemotherapy. But the chemotherapy, I think, really took a hit on his immune system because it was to a point where he couldn't eat, he couldn't do anything, and he really started to go seriously downhill after the strongest dose. Most of the pain and most of the suffering that he was having was actually a bad reaction to the chemotherapy rather than the cancer itself. But the cancer at first was bad also. He was in a lot of pain. They did surgery and removed all these lumps, and then they did the chemo, and then they also did radiation therapy. They did all of these different things. But at the end of the day, it got him, and it really, he hung in there for a while. I think November was his diagnosis, and July of the following year, which was a year ago today, is when he passed away. He was back and forth between nursing homes and hospitals. He wasn't home for very long. So I think it was November. He was home for like the first month and a half or so, like after his diagnosis. And then all of December, he was in the hospital. Didn't get to spend Christmas with him. So the last Christmas I had with him was actually 2019. And so then he was back in January. It's funny, the time that he was home, he was actually doing better. He just, he obviously wasn't 100%, of course. But he actually, it seemed like he was improving and was making recovery. But then it went downhill again. A lot of people who have experienced cancers, had relatives, will tell you it's filled with a lot of ups and downs. Like, it's not just a completely downhill decline the entire time. There are points of recovery and points of hope where you're like, man, I think he could actually beat this. And there are plenty of times where I did think that. But eventually, I think it was like early March, he was never home again. So for the last 4 months of his life, he wasn't home. He went to a hospital, then he went to a nursing home, and then it eventually became, I think the last 3 weeks or so, became a hospice arrangement. So yeah, it was really tough. I'll tell you one thing, like when he was home for, for that time, for like the 2.5 months or so, what happened was these doctors, man, and the insurance companies, they really do fuck with you. I will tell you that. Like, that's one thing you don't hear a lot about the cancer. You just think, you hear more about the tragic aspect of it, but you don't hear so much about how the medical industry fucks you over completely. And that's basically what happened with my dad and with me, was that I was basically forced to choose between him not getting his treatment or me having to drive 2 hours every single day and sit in the parking lot for 4 hours to get him to his chemo and everything, because insurance would not cover rides, and the nearest hospital that did cancer treatment was an hour away. So that was pretty shitty, and of course that was back when gas was affordable. Imagine if this happened today, I would literally go completely bankrupt. But, it just, it's one of those things, like, you don't hear as much about is the sacrifices that people do make, and I was glad to make those sacrifices, obviously. I mean, he was my fucking father, and I know if she was on the other foot, he would have done the exact same thing for me. But that definitely made it a lot harder, was dealing with that aspect, the financial aspect, and like it was weird, like the treatment was all covered, but like the rides and everything like that, like just that alone was a huge blow to the whole, everyone's bank account in the family, because my mother was doing it too, and My sister came in from time to time, like, to help him out, but she lives far away, so she was only able to come by and see him, like, 3 or 4 times during the whole situation. But, yeah, I remember the last time I ever saw him was about, I think it was 6 days before his death, and at that point they had him on all the drugs you could possibly imagine. He was high as a kite because it was the only way for him to not be screaming in pain, I guess, and for him to be somewhat comfortable, because at that point he was dying. Like, it was no question at that point that he was going to die. Like, the back of my mind, I'm like, you never know with that man, because, of all the stuff I mentioned, all the stuff he did, and he somehow survived. I'm like, I wouldn't be surprised if he was able to pull off another miracle. But unfortunately, it wasn't the case. But I remember when I did see him, I saw him on Father's Day the week before, and he didn't even know I was there. There were plenty of times where I came and he didn't even know I was there. So it was kind of like I was already talking to a dead body. Like, that's what it felt like. It felt like he was already dead. It was really tough. And then the last time, oh man, my last memory of my father was him high as a kite watching a Disney princess movie, talking about how beautiful and brave the Disney princess was and how he wants to be just like her. Yeah, that's the last memory that I have of my father alive. And then the phone call came in, 6 days later, and it wasn't a surprise. I was still devastated. And I remember for like a month straight afterwards, all I was doing every single day was just crying. Anytime I saw a photo of my father or just thought of my father, I just burst into tears. So, yeah, I mean, some people noticed that around that time, around July of last year, is when I started to be very inactive on YouTube. Well, there's your reason. Because I was dealing with the worst loss of my entire life. And with stuff like that, there's no words that can just make it better. A year later, I'm still dealing with it, and I'm still suffering, I could say. I will say, like, this, it's just a living hell right now. And, losing a parent is one of the worst things. I think the only thing worse than that is losing a child. But what made the situation even harder with my father was just a month and a half later, my grandfather died. Not of cancer, but he died. So, yeah, it was just, 2021 was a rough one for me. So I know a lot of you have been looking for me, wondering where I've been and wondering what I've been doing. Honestly, I've just been trying to come to terms with life and all the bad stuff that happens, But I just wanted to share some of my experiences, knowing people. I've never had cancer myself, but the people who I knew that have had cancer. There's actually more. Like, my grandmother died before I was born. I didn't get to meet her, and she died of cancer, and that was my father's mother. So the thought does run through the back of my mind that, like, maybe it's inevitable that one day I'm going to have cancer as well, and I'm going to be dealing with it. Like, I try not to think like that, but it's, like, a thought that definitely does come into my head every now and then, is, like, if my grandmother died and my father died, you know what I mean? I don't know, but my thoughts definitely go out with the family of Technoblade, and to any family of anyone who has died of this terrible disease that, who knows, honestly, I don't even know if there will be a cure in my lifetime. It's very doubtful, honestly. Like, I just don't know. I know cancer is a very complicated thing, and there's hundreds of different types of cancer, so it's easier said than done, but I do hope that one day we will get that. I don't know if cancer just makes too much money for them to really put too much effort into that, but it's enough is enough, man. We got to do something about this. I know, like, a lot of YouTubers are like putting up donation buttons on YouTube, like, like where you donate money to a charity. Honestly, I don't know enough about these charities to do something like that. I will say, though, that I am not making any money from ad revenue off of this video. So if you do see ads running, that is not me. I turned monetization off for myself. So if there are ads playing, then YouTube is monetizing it for themselves. But I'm not making a dime off of this video, considering the sensitive nature of this topic of cancer, and I don't want to, make money off of, because Technoblade was kind of like the introduction to this video, and that's a hot thing right now. I'm not going to try and make no money off of someone's death or anything like that. So I am, not monetized, not doing anything like that. I'm not even going to do the donation thing, because again, I don't know enough about these charities to trust them and to endorse them. So that's just what it is. But I honestly, more than anything, I just wanted to share my story and just I don't know. That's just really the only thing I want to do, is just talk about it and kind of let it out. And you know, the whole Technoblade thing kind of just provided inspiration for me, because you know, I knew someone that was the exact around the same age as Technoblade, a very close friend of mine that passed away, and then most recently I dealt with cancer with my dad. So yeah, it's an awful thing. I think, you know, almost everyone's got a story though, so it's not like I'm special or anything, but I just want to share mine. So I'll say, you know, if you guys have any stories that you know, if you have any friends or relatives that have passed away or beat cancer, you know, against all odds, they fucking beat it and they kicked cancer in the ass. Just share your stories in the comments down below. I just want to hear all your stories, and you know, we can kind of deal with it together. And I'll see you guys later. Hopefully it's not another year before I make another video, and I really don't want to leave it off on this. I definitely have another video coming soon, and that's actually gaming related, because this is a gaming channel. So yeah, until next time, peace.